All right, so you actually you're obviously like the public Elm guy, right? Like you give all these amazing talks about what I think maybe, say 5 years ago, would be an impossible thing to sell. Like you would never imagine that this thing would be like something that people would pick up. And you've somehow convinced people that not only is this something they can adopt, but that actually it will help them in so many ways. And now you're going to the next level where you're not just convincing developers, like you're working into the design realm, right? We're actually now approaching CSS from an Elm point of view. How do you go about this idea? Like, how do you pitch this as an idea to a team that is mixed between designers and developers, that it's actually a good idea to bring Elm all the way to like CSS?
That's a great question. So I have to give the caveat that like we're not using style elements at work. It's like I said in the talk, it's like very early days with that library, and like it's obviously doing things very differently from the norm. So if you have an existing team and designers are comfortable with CSS, I think you have a similar challenge to, like we did a panel on CSS yesterday, and people had similar questions about CSS and JS, and saying like, hey, if I have designers who are familiar with doing CSS with CSS files or with Sass or with less, why would they want to get on board with this? And I think the general answer is sort of, first of all, I think a lot of times like designers get not enough credit for how hard their job is. Like we have designers at work who write Elm. They work with Elm CSS. To my mind, like CSS, like learning and mastering CSS is harder than mastering like most programming languages. And if you've got somebody who's already done the work to do that, number one, I understand that if you've made that investment, you would want to run with it. But number two, I think it's important to acknowledge that they were able to master that, so they're probably able to master something else as well. There is a separate question of whether they want to, but I think that's kind of the same kind of question as asking a team of programmers, do you want to switch to a new technology? So I think all of these things are more specific forms of the general question of, if you have a team of people, how do you get them to agree on which technology choices to make? And I think the answer comes down to just having conversations with them and saying, look, we're interested in using this technology. These are the things that we think it's going to help us with. Are you on board with going outside your comfort zone so that we can work together more effectively? And having those conversations with your team, whatever your team composition, I think is the only way that you ever work those things out.
I think there's a big challenge, though. I mean, I think even Evan has kind of talked about this idea where oftentimes the sales pitch, whenever you're trying to convince your teammates, is trust me on the other side. Right? It's hard to articulate exactly how this is going to help us as a team. How would you actually approach this conversation, say with your designers? Like your designers presumably knew CSS originally. They're now writing it in, or at least bits of it in Elm. What was the compelling argument for them? Or was it just like, try it, and then like you'll see the light after a couple of months?
I mean, so for us in Elm CSS, I mean, more specifically what we talked about is things like, so there's like the general benefits of Elm, our code doesn't crash anymore, it's much easier to refactor, we have a lot more confidence in it, and then with specifically regard to Elm CSS, it's talking about like having the same language for specifying our styles as well as for specifying our view logic, and being able to sort of co-locate those means that we have a greater ability to like share code between the styles and the views, share constants for colors and things like that, and just sort of like make something that designers, at least our designers, are very concerned with is a consistent visual image and a look and feel. And Elm CSS makes it easier for us to implement that. So I recognize that from their perspective, that's something that makes their lives more challenging. But at the same time, I also, at least a couple of our designers, are excited about learning a new thing. In the same way that many programmers are like, oh, cool, this is like a new way to do something, and I can see that there'll be some benefits for me. At least some designers that we've found, feel the same way, where it is a challenge, it is something different, but that can be exciting and not just considered a burden. So yeah, I mean the benefits of Elm CSS are, I would say, similar to the benefits of CSS and JS plus the benefits of Elm itself as a language.
Interesting. So I mean, Elm originally started off as, well, maybe not originally, but it's very explicitly focused at building UIs, right? It's this application kind of focused language. and it brings a lot of benefits with its type system and its kind of thoughtful approach to the design. And then now more recently it's being applied to things like CSS and styling and whatnot. Do you feel like there are other areas that might be interesting to also apply this same technique, that where Elm you'd be surprised to see it show up, but actually it would have a lot of value?
Yeah, so I think long term there's a lot of different areas. To go back a second, so maybe not a lot of people know this, but actually originally, like the very first release of Elm did actually ship with its own layout system. It wasn't compiled to CSS. It was doing all the calculations in JavaScript and then, well, in Elm, and then just like rendering everything absolutely positioned. But that didn't really catch on. Like people were like, this is like a bridge too far. And now several years later, it's sort of like come full circle and is like, oh, cool. Now we're gonna like try that same idea of like go back to the drawing board, clean slate semantics for layout and styling, and just implement it in a different way. But as far as other domains that Elm can get into besides just UIs, one obviously that people ask about a lot is like Elm on the server, and I think that has a lot of potential long term. And basically, like Evan has been talking about, like, yeah, this seems like a compelling idea. This is something we can potentially do, but it's a huge project to like build an entire server-side ecosystem. Like generating the code to compile to whatever it is, Node.js or the Beam VM or even like LLVM. Generating that code is actually the easy part. The hard part is designing an ecosystem around it that like makes sense for Elm. And we're not even done with the web ecosystem. So Evan's view is like, why don't we like keep our focus on the web, on front end, building that up, and then once we get that to a point where we're like, okay, this is good, this is solid, like we don't need to keep our focus here. We can now start embark on another big project, then kind of go in that direction. But even within web, there's some areas where I think Elm is currently poised or in a good position to do some really interesting things. So like scientific computing, like data visualization. So Elm Plot, I know like Teresa Sokol, my coworker, has gotten like really into the idea of how can we make it super easy to make really beautiful visualizations. And this is something where you have like kind of the gold standard for what people use today is D3, which is extremely powerful, but also requires a huge amount of domain knowledge to get something that, if you're a scientist, you want to make your data look good and to make people able to interact with it easily. It's very powerful, but it's definitely a very big investment for a scientist to try and get into that. So the idea is it possible for us to design a library using Elm where the compiler can help you get into that, where it's got just enough power that you can describe the visualizations you want to present the data that you want in compelling ways, but without having to make that enormous time investment to get proficient in something as big as D3.
So it sounds like there are a number of like pretty interesting domains that it probably could be applied to, and we're kind of talking about the evolution. So along those lines, maybe you can tell us where it's going. When is the next version going to be released, and what are you most excited about?
Yeah, so the next version, Elm 0.19, it's the always answer is like when it's done. So I know like I've been talking with Evan about like progress updates, and it's like very close to an alpha release at this point, or like a package author release is more likely first, because there's always this cycle where like first package authors upgrade and like work all that out, and then application authors like we, for example, have like 50 dependencies at work. So until all those are upgraded, we can't upgrade and see what it's like as an end user. But I don't expect this to be a release that's like got a lot of breaking changes. There's like a few things, like maybe some syntax, maybe some changes in like certain rules, but at the end of the day, I think this is mainly going to be something that like improves compile times, improves people's ability to like ship small bundles to end users, and so should be a pretty smooth upgrade experience. Hopefully, we'll probably have a tool like Elm Upgrade that we did for the last upgrade from 17 to 18 that just like automates some of the syntax upgrading, and I think so it should be a pretty smooth ride once it's actually out.
Are you particularly excited about the optimizations that have been done to it, or is there maybe some new semantics that might be kind of interesting, or some new abilities in this new release?
I don't think there's any new semantics that are super interesting. This is definitely one of those like sort of primarily under the hood releases. Like one of the things Evan talked about at ElmConf in St. Louis was basically the idea of like making Elm accessible to more people. Like, so there are some companies that are like, hey, I can't use this until the bundle sizes are a lot smaller, or I can't use this until like when transitioning between pages, like in a single page application, it does like code slicing and lazy loading. And so when that's a blocker for people to use it at work, that's sort of like a big project to say, okay, how can we present this in a nice way? And you know, obviously, you can already run your Elm code through Uglify and you know, Google Closure Compiler and things like that. But the compiler has so much more knowledge about what is and is not being used that Evan's found various ways that it can actually significantly reduce the bundle size. So he's been working hard on that, and that's planned to be part of the next release. Also, server-side rendering is, you know, another thing that a lot of people have asked for. There's a third-party tool to do it, but you know, people have been asking like, hey, when is this going to be right out the box and more tightly integrated with things? That's another thing he's been working on. So kind of all in this theme of, if you're like really like, I would love to use Elm at work, but it's too many bits going down to the client, you know, too many bits for end users to download. That's an exciting thing for them. But if you're just like, hey, I just want to use Elm, then this is probably not like the most exciting release for you.
Right. I mean, still, that's the more people that you enable. I think that's fairly exciting. Let's say, for example, on my team or even as a developer, I might be very familiar with CSS, and it continues to get more and more powerful. It has more and more things. You know, like you said, they never remove anything from CSS. They only add more power. Why would I go, like, what's the compelling argument to then go and learn a new way from scratch, where I might not be able to port all over my existing knowledge of how to style and layout and whatnot?
Yeah, I'd say maintainability is like, for me, that's the exciting thing about something like style elements, is just the knowledge that, you know, as CSS code bases grow larger and larger, in my experience at least, you end up with a lot of things where there are different pieces of your page that end up coupled to different other places unintentionally. Like, you have a lot of things, so margin's a good example of this, where you have, like, if you increase the margin of some deeply nested element, that impacts all the parents all the way back up the tree. So that was one of the things that, that Matt tried to fix with, so I presented about like the difference between you have padding and then you have spacing. And one of the important design considerations there was, yeah, if you change something's padding, that's not going to, you know, necessarily affect all the parents unless you're also changing its width. Of course, if you're changing something's width, that potentially affects parents. But like spacing, again, this is like a notion of, I am a container. The elements inside me are spaced this far apart from one another. So you can increase that without actually changing, you know, the entire hierarchy. So thinking about things like that, like it's not just a matter of, you know, if I'm learning this thing from scratch, what does my code look like? But also, as I'm maintaining this thing over time, what's the difference between having a system that's designed with these goals in mind of saying like, okay, we know that we're going to build large applications. We know that we're going to get lots of elements nested inside lots of other elements. How can we design this such that when we make tweaks to these over time, which inevitably happens, it doesn't break the rest of our layout? That's not something that CSS has ever been designed with in mind. And, you know, like, as you noted, I mean, they're always adding things to the spec, but as they add more things, that just increases the number of ways that that we could potentially have unexpected interactions. So keeping the API small and, you know, focused on user interfaces that scale and maintain really well, I think is a compelling pitch for the long term.
I think that makes a lot of sense. One concern I have is that as developers, we are always excited about power, right? Give me lots of power. And kind of counterintuitively, Elm in many ways says you don't want that much power, right? You actually want this other thing over here, right? And power is like an approximation for this thing that you're trying to get. So similarly, like you're restricting the use of these powerful CSS features in some ways. How do you go about selling this idea of you don't actually want all that sugar, you don't want all of that power? Is it just maintainability? Is communication an important part? Like, how do you actually sell this to other people?
Yeah, so I think the tension in my mind is between like flexibility and guarantees. So I don't know which of those you want to call power, but so like global mutable variables, super flexible. You can do so many things with them. including shoot every appendage off, like not just your foot, but your whole leg. I mean, you can shoot, it's just, there's like huge potential for downside there. So Elm doesn't have global mutable variables. There's no way to have, anything like that. And on the one hand, you could look at that and you could say, oh, that's very restrictive. But on the other hand, you could look at that and you say, that gives me really strong guarantees. There's this whole class of things that I don't have to worry about anymore because I just don't have that foot gun. And it's the same way as I see it with styling. You can say I have these primitives that are very convenient. So a good example of this would be descendant selectors. I can say like any button, no matter any button element anywhere on the page, anything that is descendant of that, I want it to have a blue background. And maybe when I'm styling my page right now, that's very convenient because it lets me kill 3 birds with 1 stone. But then down the line, 6 months down the line, I realize, oh, wait a minute, now it's actually quite difficult to style a new button because now I've got this legacy thing, which I have to go back and refactor and make sure, am I not breaking anything? Like, I want to change that, I want to refactor it, but it's being used in how many different places? I don't know. So just having these guarantees that like, oh, I know that nothing is styled that way. I know that that's not a capability that the language or the library gave me, means that I can now add new things and not have to worry about there being impacted by old things, or vice versa. When I'm adding a new thing, I don't have to worry that it's going to cause a regression in an old thing. And I think that's, if we're talking about power, to me, that's a powerful idea.
So kind of staying on this topic of guarantees. So Reason and OCaml, so Reason ML is a similarly typed language in some ways. That chose to use Npm as its package manager. And so we have this huge sea of packages that we can use. You mentioned that Elm doesn't use Npm. Like, why would you go that path? Like, what are you actually getting in return for that?
Yeah, I mean, that's also another great example of just like Elm's focus on guarantees. So I guess the biggest things that you get are, for Elm package, you know that every package on there, it compiles. It definitely type checks. So if you install it, it's going to it's going to do what it says in the docs in terms of like its types, and it respects semantic versioning, which in Elm is defined as if you make a breaking change, that is, you change an API, you alter the type such that something might not compile anymore, or you delete something, that's a major version bump. It has to be. And the package manager will not accept your change unless you bump the major version number when you do something like that. Minor version is defined as I just added something, I didn't take anything away, or do any major changes. And patch is I didn't even add anything, I changed nothing. This was just implementation detail changes. So using that, it gives you a lot more confidence when you're installing something. You can just have a version number range, and you can say like, okay, I expect that this is going to be between versions 3 and 4, like greater than or equal to 3, less than 4, and I can be confident that anything in that range is going to compile. Which means that since all the libraries are usually implemented in terms of version ranges, the dependency solver can say, okay, I'm going to grab this version like 3.4.1 of this library, and this other library needs something between versions 3 and 5, so I'll grab version 3.4.2 from that library, and you say, oh, wait a minute, actually, can this first one use 3.4.2? Oh, it can, cool. And then you can just pick the right dependency from each of these, which means you get a lot more code sharing. So getting back to the earlier idea of bundle sizes, so I know this is something that NPM has struggled with a bit, is that if you want to have really permissive version ranges, sometimes those versions don't necessarily quite work well together. But in Elm, it's by design, every package in the ecosystem follows these guarantees, which means that it can just say, okay, I'm only, even though I have 3 or maybe even 5 different packages that are using this one library, I can just find one version of that works with all of them and just have that be the only one that's included in the final output bundle. So there's a lot of benefits to having the whole ecosystem this way. Now, the big drawback is that the size of the NPM ecosystem is, and the size of the Elm package ecosystem is way, way smaller. So we have a much smaller number of high quality packages, and it's going to take time. Like we're doing it the hard way for sure, to build that up to the point where it has the same amount of, the same percentage of off the shelf stuff that NPM does. The good news is though, I mean, we've been making good progress on this. In the early days, it was a lot of oh, I want to do X, I'm going to have to write it myself, and maybe I'll publish a package. But now I would say most of the time, if I'm looking for something off the shelf, I feel like it's there in Elm package. In NPM, I think almost every time, it's almost always there off the shelf. So we're definitely not there, but making good progress. And the idea is that we're taking the long view, and then in the long run, we'll be happy with that result.
I'm really interested in this idea of it's almost like all the tooling and all the processes enforces that idea of like be kind to each other, right? So like, you know, don't break my code if you don't have to, right? If you are breaking it, make sure you tell me. Give me all these guarantees. It's very interesting. Kind of going back to the CSS kind of work that you've been doing and showing off, how do you handle things like animation, the development experience, this kind of thing?
So is this a question about style elements or Elm CSS? Because I gave a lightning talk on Elm CSS.
Style
elements.
Yes.
Yeah, great question. So so the author of style elements is also the author of Elm style animation, which is a library for doing animations not using like CSS keyframes, but rather just like managing your own state and doing like, you know, springs and all sorts of things to transition between you know, different animation states. I have to confess, I'm not an expert in that library, but I know that that's like what people use. I know we're using it at work, but I've only like tweaked it a little bit. I've never actually like built something from it from scratch. So what I can say is that I know that style elements being authored by the same person who authored like the premier animations library at Elm is designed to work very well with that. And so I would say if you're looking for some animation solution in style elements, probably what you're going to end up with is the same thing that you would use if you were not using style elements.
In both cases of these libraries, do you have hot code reloading without state loss so your designers and developers can iterate very quickly?
I would say that we would, so except that feature got broken in a transition between Elm 16 and 17 because a lot of internals got changed, and it hasn't been re-added yet. So both that one and time travel debugging like got broken, and sort of like Evan was like, okay, we can fix these, but there are other things that seem higher priority, so we're gonna like circle back to those later. So that will presumably come back in a future release, at which point that will be true. But like at the exact moment right now, it's not available. One of the things with that was that something that we've observed in other communities is that hot code reloading is something where if it's reliable and you believe that it's going to work and you trust it, it's really valuable. And if it's not, wow, it's like really rough. And so Evan was like, yeah, we can do a really good job with this because the compiler has so much information, and we can really narrow down the cases and say like, okay, we're not able to hot reload right now because of this exact thing. This change that you made is going to be incompatible with that. But enumerating all those cases and making sure that, like, seriously, if it reloads, you know that it's actually going to work, is actually a serious project. And so, like, making sure that we want to like get that right and make it be a tool that people can really trust and like rely on 100% of the time, where like it's enabled by default and nobody ever worries about it, is a serious enough undertaking that it's just been like prioritized under some of these other things, like making the language more accessible to more companies.
So you mentioned the history replay, which is, you know, makes for a very killer demo. Do you use this in actual work, and do you use the Elm debugger as well? Like, what does your kind of tooling setup look like for a typical day?
Yeah, so at work we use like the time travel debugger. Like we have that turned on by default in development mode, so everyone can access it. To be perfectly honest, like 90% of the time, all I use it for is just to like get a quick look at the current state without having to log anything. Like I'll be like, wait, that messed up. Why did that mess up? Like open the debugger and it's like, okay, here's your entire application state. And I'm like, oh, I see, that's not it. When that's not it, maybe I'll go back a couple of frames and look at the state and be like, okay, wait, why is it that? Why is it that? Why is it? Oh, I see. It's been that for, you know, for a while in the state. And I'm like, okay, so that gives me like a good clue for where to start looking for where the bug in my business logic is. But as far as like the actual visuals going back and forth, I have not been using that as much as I thought I would. Like I was like really excited about that feature when it came out, but in practice, it just seems like the main benefit of it turns out actually to be the simplest thing of all, which is just like being able to glance at the application state immediately. So it's almost like in the parlance of like debuggers that, you know, work around breakpoints and things like that. It's almost just like having a watch on everything in your application state is really useful, and the time travel is kind of like the icing on the cake. Same thing for the import export, like being able to share things with your coworkers for reusability. It's really cool that you can do that, but in practice, I just haven't found myself doing it, or like wanting to do it very often, just because like, even though like downloading a file and sending it to them is really fast, it's often even faster to be like, hey, that thing broke when you do the thing, so just, yeah.
Do you guys actually use the Elm debugger at No Red Ink?
Yeah, we do. I mean, but like I said, I mean, it's part of our workflow, but the main benefits are not the parts that make for the coolest demo.
Interesting. So you mentioned kind of the compiler has so much information about the code that we're writing, and it feels like the tooling for Elm could just be stupendous. What is the current setup in terms of like editors and whatnot that I should be using, IDEs or whatnot? And two, like where do you hope to see the tooling go? Like what would be like the cool thing that you think could happen?
Yeah, great questions. So as far as like status quo, I think Atom has the best plugins. So Elm Jutsu in particular is the plugin that really does the coolest stuff for my money. So I used to work as like an enterprise Java developer, and essentially the only thing that I miss about that was the refactoring tools, like the IDE tools. I mean, IntelliJ, IDEA, and like Eclipse, and all of those NetBeans, like they just have so many things that, like when I switched to other languages where I'm more using like Vim and Atom and Sublime Text and stuff like that, I was just like, yeah, I miss that. I miss being able to right-click and hit refactor rename. So at least in Atom, I haven't kept as much up with the other editors because I've been using Atom for more than a year now. I know like we do actually have refactor rename. Like I can say rename this module and it'll rename the module, not just like the module name itself, but also go and everywhere I've used that module, it'll rename it so that theoretically everything just compiles again.
And is it doing that via the typed information, or is it just like a string search and replace?
I think it's with the type information, but
Very cool,
I wouldn't swear to it. So I know that it's on Evan's radar to make more and more information, like to make a nicer and nicer API for editor authors to access information that the compiler has. And like that's an explicit goal of his. I know there's also some people working on an Elm language server, like the Microsoft standards, so that multiple editors can make use of that. But I think they're pretty early on in it. I don't think they've like totally they're like off and running with it yet. As far as like things that I would love to see in the future, the biggest one that I want to see is like autocomplete for forward pipe. So like when you, if you're familiar with the pipe operator, it's like it's a lot like the dot in object-oriented languages, where you'll say pipe and then like right after that I want to write a function that operates on the thing that I'm working on right now, and you chain these things together. So that's another thing that I miss was like I would, you know, in IntelliJ or whatever, I would hit dot, and then it would just pop up with this dropdown of like, here's all the things that could go after that. Here are all the methods on that object. And similarly in Elm, you know, you can know here are all the things that are in scope that go with that type. Like after I hit pipe, and being able to do that and just see like, okay, here they are, and just pick from a list, pretty nice. And that seems like the compiler has the information to do that, but of course it's a project to integrate that with the tooling. So I think there's some cool stuff like that, and there's also some cool stuff as far as not just like refactor rename, but there's a whole bunch of other similar operations that you want to do, like I want to extract this thing as a function. Elm Jutsu does that. Like if you want to pull something out and like say, oh, I want to pull this up into a let expression, or things like I want to remove this argument from a function, and not just have to go track down all the places that are calling it with the extra argument, but just say like just delete that argument and also all the call sites, just make them all not pass anything there anymore. Little things like that, just it's nice to not have to do them manually.
So I think we're close out of time. There were some good questions about, you know, Elm doesn't have this concept of components that we're kind of used to. Questions around like how to handle deeply nested states and whatnot. And then I think there was one that might be good to round it out, which is, when are you planning to release this book so that we can know all of this?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I can touch on each of those. So the book, I'm writing the 7th chapter of 10 at the moment. It's not chapter 7 though. I'm skipping ahead to chapter 10 because so chapter 7 involves Elm CSS and probably will involve Elm Plot, and both of those are in the middle of like serious release changes, like API changes. So I don't want to like have to have tension between those two. Chapter 10 is performance optimization. That's not really changing. So I'm working on chapter 10. So like, when's the book going to be out? I was hoping to have chapter 10 turned, or all 10 chapters turned in first draft by the end of 2018, but I think I'm unlikely to hit that goal. So probably sometime in 2019. Okay, then the others were...
So when that's out, is that going to tell me how to handle deeply nested states and code reuse across my components and whatnot?
Sure, yeah. So Yes. So Chapter 8 is single-page applications. Chapter 9 is scaling Elm applications, and both of those would cover those things. So I've talked about both of those in at my Elm Europe talk last year. So it's called Scaling Elm Applications. Check it out. So sort of briefly, like the notion of like Elm doesn't have components. Specifically, what we mean by that is like Elm doesn't have like a concept of local mutable state. Everything's immutable and everything's a pure function, and there's no way to say like I have this thing with its self-contained mutable state. Because essentially that's an object-oriented idea. So I know like Reason has this. Like Reason has first-class support for objects, and like JavaScript of course has this. But Elm like very intentionally doesn't have this. And so to make a long story short, the answer is that so the question is like what do I do instead of that? That's what's familiar to me. I'm used to object-oriented programming. I'm used to doing this in this style. Like what should I do if I find myself unable to do that? And the answer essentially is to use functions and to use the sort of like the smallest, narrowest type you can. So if you want to have a reusable logo, that's just like a piece of HTML. There's no function involved. You just pick it up and just put it wherever you want. If you want to make a button, maybe that button is a function that's parameterized on the text of the button. If you want to make a checkbox, that's got a little bit of state in it, but it's just a Boolean, like is it checked or not? So you just have a function that accepts, am I checked or not? So essentially you can work your way up, and this is what I do in the Elm Europe talk, is I go through like all these different APIs for reuse. And there is no one-size-fits-all way like there is like in React. You have everything as a component. Everything could potentially have local state. In Elm, it's the other way around. You have everything is stateless by default, and you opt in to more and more state using more and more different API strategies, but finding the simplest one that works. That's the best way to achieve like a nice scaling experience. And I realize that it's definitely not familiar if you're coming from an OO background. But we've been really happy with how it's scaled at work, and I'm happy to like recommend doing it that way. I think there was one more question though in there. Deeply nested state. Yeah. So deeply nested state is one of those things that it's an interesting framing. So the question is like, how do I deal with deeply nested state? And usually I think what people mean is like deeply nested state updates. Like I want to take my entire model, which maybe has a record inside here that has 5 fields, and inside that it's got a record with 3 fields, and inside that there's a record with like 4 fields. How do I, given a function that just takes the whole model in, how do I update that thing that's 4 levels deep? And the answer is that if you find yourself wanting to do that, what this should actually be is a red flag that it's something where you want to refactor. So it's ideal to have your functions take the narrowest types possible. This is another thing that I talk about in the talk, where like basically the narrower your types, the less you have to keep in your head when maintaining each function. So actually having a lot of functions that are taking your entire application model makes debugging harder. Like it's definitely a hindrance in the long term. And so it's like very beneficial to say like I'm just going to have a function that works in terms of that leaf, like that one record with 4 fields. At which point it's not a deeply nested update anymore. It's just like, oh, I'm just working with that one piece of data. If you need some additional piece of data from the model, let's say like at the very top level, you got a function that works on this leaf, and then it also needs one value from the root of the application state. Write a function that takes the leaf and then takes just that one value. Maybe it's a string, maybe just have it take that one value. That's going to be a lot easier to maintain long term than if you have something that takes like, oh, I need everything, I promise. I need every single bit of that entire application state, and all my functions need that. When you're going through and debugging, this ends up really hindering you. And so essentially the intuition is when I see that I have this need for deeply nested state, I say, oh, actually the right answer is not to try to say, how can I reach inside and modify this, but rather to say, how can I refactor such that I don't need that anymore?
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Please give it up for Richard.
Thanks.